hard drive. It's got like 5 gigs of solid state that you can keep your OS on.
Oh, you can get cheaper than that, but never mind. I digress. So, anyways, starting a Photoshop tutorial, we're gonna start from the very basics and quickly advance up to some various GM tools such as making tokens and map making and other basic editing skills that could be handy for your campaigns. So, this is Photoshop. Probably seen it before. If not, welcome to it. Welcome to my hell. There are some basic tools that you should be aware of before we venture forth into the great unknown. First of all, you've got this tool palette here. You may find that your screen does not look exactly like mine. This is okay. You can find everything through this Windows folder. So, and I'm not going to explain what each of them are. A lot of Photoshop is just fiddling and looking at new things and trying new things. And eventually you'll find something really cool. So this, however, happens to be the tool palette, and you'll probably use this most next to this layers palette over here. So make sure you've got your layers palette up, and make sure you've got your toolbar up. Now just quickly advancing through these, there's a lot of common symbolism that you're probably familiar with, so I won't go over all of them. But this is your most important one. This is the move tool. The shortcut for this is V. If you press V, it will call up this tool. And as is, it's pretty standard. I'm just going to quickly spawn a couple shapes to show you something. So I use this move tool, and I can move around this shape. You know, click, move it. Pretty self-explanatory. But as you can see, if I try and click on the other one, it just sort of moves the first one. Now, you can easily go to auto select up here, and I've known designers who have used Photoshop for like 4 years, and they just were not aware that this was a thing. And now you can automatically just click one, click the other, click one, click the other, and just move them around independently. You can also change this to groups, and you can group layers together. We'll touch on that later. And then you can move them together as a unit. This is helpful for all sorts of things that I'll let you imagine. So next is your marquee tool. That's selecting stuff. You click, you drag, it's a marquee. Neat. We've all used paint. We know what that is. There's one that's a hand tool. Same deal. This is your magic wand. And it's the third tool down, as you can see. Now, this is a very, very useful tool. I'm just going to very quickly demonstrate what it can do. So I'll find a picture. This is just the first thing that always pops to mind. Nick Cage. My God, he's a beautiful creature. I'll bring that to front. Now you'll notice that these tools only work when I'm on a raster layer. And what is a raster layer? You'll notice that I dropped these 2 circles down at the start. These are what's known as a vector. Now, the difference between a vector and a raster is that a raster is a collection of pixels. It's a set amount of data, and the more you zoom in, the less information you have. You can resize this, but it will always only have the information that you see here. A vector, on the other hand, is actually a mathematical equation. It's a collection of points with tangents that direct where a shape will go. And so this shape, I can make it bigger forever, and it will always look like this. And you'll see it, vector illustrations. We're not going to cover that today because that's a whole thing all by itself. But they make 2 different kinds of layers, and the way you can tell is that there's this little tiny square thing with what's called a path. If you look at where my cursor is in the bottom right corner, there's a little path symbol, and that means it's a vector layer. If it does not have that, it is a raster layer. And the moral of the story is that you can only paint, select, or fudge around with, and by that I mean use filters or the paint tool or whatever, on a raster layer. So I'm gonna make these go away and backspace those. I did paste this image into Photoshop by just hitting Control V or paste. I'm sure you guys are familiar with those. So the magic wand tool. Up here, this is the tool options bar, and you'll notice that there is a tolerance. If you set that up, the higher you set it, the more like colors it will be willing to select. So I can start kind of selecting portions of his face, and it'll select everything that has a similar color. Obviously, this isn't going to work very good for selecting his head out of this image because there's a lot of like colors here. If I try and select the background, it selects a lot of his face. Now, in Photoshop, there's a lot of tools that are hidden away in like tools. You'll see my mouse is over on the left here. If I click and drag down, it shows me something called a quick selection tool. A quick selection tool is a lot like the magic paintbrush or the magic wand in that it automatically selects things, but this time it's using contour data to automatically select like areas. So I can carefully paint around the perimeter of his face, and it actually does a pretty decent job of clipping into the area around it. And this is a good chance to introduce you to the modifier keys, which is going to be Alt, Control, and Shift. And these all do different things for different tools, and I'll explain them as I go along. But again, this is something that you learn best through fiddling. Don't try and memorize it today because it'll change. Changes for different tools, and God knows if you have to use a Mac and a PC, the configuration will change again. So often a lot of what I do is flailing until I recognize the symbol that I want to use. So in this case, we're going to deselect his ear here because as you can see, it didn't really select this ear. And I'm using the zoom tool right now. You can access this quickly by hitting Z. And we're going to go back to the magic, is this a magic paintbrush? What do they call this? Quick selection tool. And if I hold down Alt, you'll notice there's a little minus sign next to my paintbrush, and it'll very quickly let me deselect that area. So, zooming back out, we have a pretty decent cutout of Nick Cage's head. Now, there are all different kinds of ways we can cut this out, and I'm teaching you these selection tools right now because they're pretty imperative. If you use Photoshop, this was basically one of its initial purposes, is being able to modify photos. So, God damn it, if I'm teaching a Photoshop class, you better learn how to edit photos. Now, once you have a tool image selected, one of the most powerful things about Photoshop is masking and selecting, like just coming up with different ways to select things. And there's this brilliant thing called Refine Edge, and it lives up here. As long as you've got a selection tool selected, you'll have Refine Edge right up here in the tool palette. And if I click on that, you'll notice it makes a silhouette of his head. And if I go up to View here, you can choose all kinds of different things. You can have Marching Ants, which is that great marquee, or Overlay, which is the red overlay. But personally, I prefer on black because it makes this little outline very specific. And you'll see that actually, you know, it did a pretty decent job selecting things all by itself. But there's these little crispies right here, and if you're a perfectionist like me, you like to get rid of those. And this is a really easy way of doing that. You can just smooth out your edges a little bit, and you see there's this Adjust Edge tool. Once again, this is one of those things that you just have to flail on. But I'll give you a quick description of each of these, and you'll probably forget them, but hey, this is a recorded video, so if you get interested, you can always go back and look. The Radius tool is actually a smart, like color finding tool that will go on the image, say, hey, it's got this orange ear selected. What are some similar orange areas and contours around the image to select? And it'll sort of start branching out and reaching for areas that are similar. And you can adjust that up or down to tell the computer to go and look for more areas or not. Smooth will smooth out contours and try and create rounder edges. Feather will expand the edge and soften it. Contrast will harden an edge and remove the anti-alias. And an anti-alias is the gray area between the black and the white space. The black here representing your selected area. So whenever you've got a selection, by moving the contrast up, you are getting rid of the anti-alias or grays in the mid area. Likewise, if you use Shift Edge, this will move the area in or out. And you'll notice if you have Feather on, it'll actually move it in or out quite a bit more. So anyways, everything with moderation. That is my tip for the day, is no matter what you're messing around with Photoshop, whether it's drop shadows, or these little selection tools, a lot tends to go, or a little tends to go a long way. So everything with moderation. Um, so anyways, we're done with that. Got a little bit of a better selection going. And now I'm going to teach you something that tripped me up a lot whenever I started using Photoshop. And what that is what's called the live selection tool. And now I accidentally hit this, and I spent 2 days in agony trying to figure out why I could suddenly only paint in black and white and everything is red. Oh God, what is happening? You'll notice up here my color palette has turned to black or white. If I select a swatch, it will only make gray happen. What is happening? The world has come to an end. What this is Photoshop has a mode where you can actually paint your selections. So everything that's red right now, if I hit this button again, and you'll see it's over here, it's the little cookie looking symbol. If I click this, it'll turn everything I just painted into a selection, and you'll see the little marching ants here. So I'm going to just quickly undo that by hitting Control Z. That might be Control Alt Z on your setup. You can modify your key bindings however you like by going up to properties and doing all that good stuff, but I believe Control Z starts off as Control Shift Z. So anyways, I've got a selection. What do I do with it? I've got Nick Cage's face. Where do I put it? How can I move this somewhere else? Well, first of all, I'm going to get rid of these borders, so I'm going to use this marquee tool up here. I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to deselect these areas. Oops. Have to move off a live selection tool. Now there we go. So holding down Alt, as you can see, that actually deselected this stuff. I'm going to hit Control Shift I, and that inverses my selection. You can also get to this through Select, and you'll notice there's a bunch of different tools here. So my selection is now inversed, and I'm going to remove everything I don't want until it's just his head and shoulders. And now I'm going to introduce you to the second most useful tool in Photoshop, and that is called masking. And what's this mean? I've deleted his background. Okay, that's great, but couldn't I do that with delete or backspace? Yeah, you could, but that would also delete the information behind him. And sometimes you really want to bring that back. And in this case, maybe not so much, and you'll see there's this little black and white outline over here. This is part of something called non-destructive photo editing, and this is a whole suite of options that are over here under this half moon cookie, and there's all kinds of things that you can do over here that I'll briefly touch on a little bit later that will modify your image in such a way that you can always change it back later and kind of take away and put back whenever you like. And this is extremely powerful. It's very useful, and if you're not using them, then you might as well just use Paint. So now this mask can be modified, and you do that by clicking on it over here on the layer palette. You just click on that little image and that'll select it, and then you can click on the image itself and you can change that. So now the difference between this is that when I'm on the image, I can actually modify the image and add features, as you can see. But if I am doing this on the masking layer, I'm actually going to be, instead, I can't draw on the image itself. I am telling it to add back parts of the image that I have masked away, or I can remove them by selecting black, and now I can paint objects off. So let's say I want to get rid of his shoulders. I can paint that away, and I can remove it whenever I like. So what is this brush tool I'm using, which I just selected, by the way? You can hit this by, you can select this by pressing B or going over here. Whenever you right-click, it brings out this brush palette. And there's a bunch of basic brushes up here. There's a bunch of different Photoshop brushes. Once again, this is something you just kind of have to flail around with. All these neat ones are directional. You can, if you have a tablet, you can kind of move your pen around and it does stuff. Down here, they're a little fancier. But let's just stick with a round brush for now because it's pretty simple. You can also change the diameter up here, so this will make it bigger or smaller. And you can change the hardness, which will turn it into an airbrush or not. One of the first things that you'll be struck with as you're using this tool is it's got this little spotty tapering. And if you're an illustrator, You've probably gotten to the point where you open up Photoshop for the first time and you find yourself enormously frustrated because every time you're using a large brush like this, it's making those little taper marks. Now those are on purpose, and they make your computer work a little faster, and they can make a brush with a low flow. And what that means is a flow is the rate at which the color is dropped. So if I have a very high flow, it's very opaque, and if I have a very low flow, it's very slow building up. But if you move over here to what's known as the brush palette, there's a whole bunch of different options, and we'll touch on this again later. But for now, let's hit the most important part, and that's the spacing tool. And as I move it out here, you'll notice that it gets farther and farther away, and that's just completely fucking useless. But I like to close that up all the way to the left, and then you get a nice, smooth, perfect line, and you can very quickly go through and finish editing out Nick Cage's beautiful floating omnipotent head. And so what's the advantage of having this beautiful floating omnipotent head? What can you do with this, one might ask? I hear you say. Well, now that we have it edited out like this, we can actually move it into other things. And in Photoshop, it's as easy as clicking and dragging. So right now, I have this image sort of separated out. It's on this background layer. By the way, I'll quickly explain what this is because it can be vexing for people who have never been on Photoshop before. Your background layer is one of the first things that spawns with a new file. You'll notice that there's this little lock icon here. What that means is it's a background layer. It's the only kind of layer that'll get this kind of lock. You can lock it yourself, but if you just double click on this, you can hit OK and make it into a real layer. A background layer really just means that it won't move around, which is really handy because if you're just moving stuff around on screen, you can drag it off and then it's like floating all over the place and what the hell's even going on? So as a background layer, it's not giving you that problem, but just in case you're ever wondering why you can't move it or get rid of it or do something weird to it, that's why, and that's how you can get rid of it. So if I mess this away, you'll see there's a bunch of checkers. What this means is that's a transparency. If there's checkers apparent, that means there's nothing there. You can safely export this head, and I'm hitting a hotkey right now, and my computer, there we go. And this is saved for web, and we'll touch on this again later when we're exporting icons. But you can see if I export this as a GIF or a PNG, I can actually export this entirely transparent and he'll have nothing behind him whenever I drop him down on web. But I can also drag him straight from this window over to the next. Bring him up to the top layer. And oops. So what happened there is I had his mask selected. Or oops. Yeah. I had his mask selected, so I was dragging him around inside the mask, which isn't what you want, so I just deselected that, selected his head, and now I can move him around. So you can think about applications for that yourself. There's tons of them. It's basic image editing. If you've ever been on 4chan or you wanted to make a cat riding a rocket, that's how you do it. So moving past that, you've got your basic editing down. Let's move on to one of the most common things you'll be doing as a GM, and we'll use some of these tools we've just learned. How to make an icon that is not squished and has, it's round and transparent, all that goodness. For that, I'm going to be using my absolute favorite image from the Fantasy Flight series of books from Warhammer 40k, and it's this beautiful picture of a Chaos Undivided heretic sniffing an Imperial priest. So, how do we turn this into an icon? Well, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. The easiest way is to simply take this marquee tool and you select a circle, but as you can see, it's kind of, it's stretching out wide, it's stretching out down. You can hold down Shift and it'll store the ratio. And this is universal across Photoshop. If you're ever trying to make a marquee, if you're trying to resize something, if you hold down Shift, it'll maintain the ratio that it had. And this is all well and good, and I can move this around, and I can make this marquee, select this, and you know, Control I, inverse the selection, delete. But you know, I don't really like this composition. I've got words over here. It's not working out for me. So we're going to make use of what we just learned, which is masking, to really be able to very quickly turn around an icon that's just exactly what we want. And we're going to go back over here to this circle. And this is a vector tool. It's going to make you a vector circle. And up here, Photoshop just made this a little bit more complicated because they gave your vectors the ability to have a fill and a stroke. And what is the difference between a fill and a stroke? I hear you cry. Stroke is the line that traces across a vector path. So if it's a line that you draw out with this pen tool, which is what you use to create vectors wholesale, you'll see that there's this little line that's tracing it. That is a stroke. If I just make a little bubble, it's going to automatically fill with this brown stroke. It's the default for Photoshop. It's annoying. I don't know why it doesn't. If you go up to fill, you can actually put a color in there, and you can get rid of the stroke. And the way you do this is you just kind of hit the drop down, you pick a color, you hit stroke, you hit this little white bar with the red cross across it, and it makes it transparent. And we've got a circle. I didn't make it a square ratio coming out, so I'll just quickly delete that, hit backspace, go back to a circle tool, hold down shift, drag it out. There you go. It's automatically left that stroke there and made it have no fill, which is annoying, but there we go. We've got a perfect circle. And once again with the little circle tool over here. So, icon. We're going to go over here to the layer palette where we've pasted this page from the book. Move that up to the top, and we're going to do what's called a clipping mask. Now it's the same thing as the mask that I showed you before, except it saves them as different layers. So what this does is it makes the image above, and I should probably do a better job of explaining what layers are. Layers are exactly what they sound like. If you remember being back in grade school where there were layers of plastic cellophane that your teacher would put on the overhead and draw on, that's basically the same concept. Think of it like layers and layers of cellophane that either opaque, which means solid images, or transparent, think like a watercolor, that could be layered on top of each other. In this case, our layer has been clipped to the layer below it, which means it will only show up in the places where the layer below it is opaque. It probably doesn't make much sense now, but tool around with it a little bit, you'll find it's a pretty useful tool. And now the nice part about this is I'm just clicking and I'm dragging it around, and I can get just how I want. I can zoom in right on this, like, very kind of, he seems like he's enjoying it, doesn't it? That's kind of creepy. And I don't really want his nose there. It's kind of freaking me out, so I'm just going to upsize this a little bit. You don't want to do that too much because, like I said, it'll distort the image. But if you're just making an icon like this, it's fine. So we got it zoomed in, positioned just how we want it. I'm going to mask, and that's just clicking this eye, this layer, and that makes it so I can only see what I've got here. Now, I want to isolate this image because it's got all this space around it, and if I save this image like that, it's gonna kind of just be floating out in space, and it'll be this huge image. So I'm just gonna crop the layer down, and you guys are probably familiar with this. You can do it in Paint. Crop tool's right here. It's pretty universal symbology there, and I'm gonna center it. Now there's other ways of doing this, but that's probably the most obvious way, so we'll stick with that for now. And now let's say I put this image, and I'm just going to quickly spawn a layer here. Don't worry about how I do this. It's not important. Say I've dropped this image on a map that has a black background. Can't really see much of what's going on here. So I'm going to quickly show you something called layer styles. And we'll go into those a bit more later whenever I show you how to make maps. But for now, I'm just going to briefly skim over how you can employ them. So this little icon here, once I'm satisfied with the placement of it, I'm actually going to merge it with the layer below that it's clipped to. And the way you do that is by clicking on the layer, holding down Shift. You can select more than one thing, and so I'm going to select it and the layer below it, and then I'm going to right click and hit Merge Layers. Now, you don't want to hit merge visible because that'll merge everything you see on the screen, and flatten image will flatten everything to a single layer. There are times when these are useful, but those times are not now. So we're going to merge these layers. That makes it one image. You can easily slide it around. And I'm going to hit this FX button. Once again, this is a great lesson in moderation. So I'm going to go to Inner Glow, and you'll see I get this nice little inner light, and as you can see, there's all these different options, and there's all these different styles that I can apply to something. What do they all do? So many things, so many options, so many possibilities. I can't possibly go over them all right now, but I'll give you a brief overview. And this guy's the perfect guy to do it on. So bevel and emboss is exactly what it sounds. It will make an icon. And here, let's do this on a layer that looks a little more so you can see what's going on. So going back, bevel and emboss, it will literally do what it says, where it makes it look like a pog. And it's kind of a fake effect. It doesn't really look great. But there are times when this is very useful. Just that time's not now. That's kind of like the moral of Photoshop is this thing is very useful, but you got to kind of find the specific time whenever it is. Stroke, once again, you're probably familiar with this. In earlier versions of Photoshop, this was the only way that you could stroke a path, but now they've made it into an actual aspect of vectors. So a little history lesson for you there. You can, again, adjust the size of this. More importantly, you can adjust the position. So if I want to make an outline on this pog, I can set it on the center, and I can make it smaller. And let's say I want to make all of the enemies' outlines red, just so players can quickly refer to which tokens are theirs and tokens are enemies. I can quickly make this red, and it kind of does that. And that's nice, so I'll leave it. Inner shadow puts a shadow on the inside of the image. It's fairly obvious, not too much mysticism there. Inner glow, same thing, makes it glow. Now, inner shadow and inner glow you can do a lot of the same things with them, except the difference is that inner shadow can actually be directionally shifted. So I can move this shape down and actually change the angle, and it'll go to different positions. And you'll see this is useful whenever I do a drop shadow, and we've all heard of a drop shadow. If you're a designer or this sort of thing falls into your purview where you're just like creating things, #1 tip with Photoshop, never leave the layer styles in their presets. You can see it a mile away. Drop shadow is especially guilty of this. So whenever you're using a layer style, always modify it to look just how you want it. You'll come out with something even better than what you had just with the presets, and it'll look a little less muddy. And you'll notice with the different tools here that I'm gradually shifting through, you can kind of change the different size, you can change the spread, which basically modifies how quickly it goes from black to white on the inner or outer side of this line. Once again, it's minimizing the anti-alias that we discussed earlier, the grays in between. So the farther the spread, the sharper the line. The thinner the spread, the softer it is. I like to usually have it somewhere in the middle so I can have kind of a nice crisp drop shadow. And this is actually pretty good. We're going to be looking at this image from pretty far away. I'm going to move the opacity up a little bit. And what this will do is it'll make the pog look like it's coming a little bit off the screen. And it'll give you a little bit more sense that it's not part of the background. Now, let's look at briefly some of the other tools here. There's satin, which is kind of, it fills the image from the inside. It's kind of like a color overlay, except it starts a little ways inside the image. Very rare times I find this useful. Play with it. You can do neat things with it. Not going into it today. Color overlay, fairly obvious. It puts a color in the thing. This isn't very useful unless you're doing something very specific, so we'll leave that out. Gradient overlay could be useful. If you want to do something shiny and neat, you can just switch this to an overlay layer, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. And that'll very quickly give you kind of a nice little, kind of like it looks like he's kind of coming out of the darkness there, and you can see whenever I disable this and re-enable it, the difference between flat and the, like, it's just a little bit more contrast. It makes it a little more interesting. Anyways, your mileage may vary, so employ that at your own risk. Moving on, pattern overlay. Don't use this. Just don't. There are times when it's useful. Those times are very rare. Just don't. Outer glow. Once again, self-explanatory. So let's hit OK, and that gives us this nice little pog here. And you'll notice if I add a background color to this, or a map, let's move him to the wild where he would actually live. And I'm just going to quickly do a key combination here. For all those curious, you'll notice that there is a layer style in all this. If I just hit Control A, which selects everything, it selects the whole area, and Control C, which is copy. You can also hit that by going up to Edit and Copy. It will only select this image, and if I paste it on this map, you'll notice I've lost my layer styles. Oh, that's no good. The reason for this is it's only really copying the image information. You want to select everything that's on this canvas, and the way you can do that is by doing something called copy merged, and that basically copies a merged version of your canvas, and you'll see it's right here. And I'm going to hit Control A to select everything, and I'm going to hold down Control Shift and C, and that's the shortcut for Control Copy Merged. And then I can once again paste it on this map, and as you can see, it's got that nice red outline, and it's got the drop shadow. By the way, if you're on your movement tool, you'll see that there are show transform controls up here in the upper left. Whenever you've got that on, you'll see that there's little handles on the side here. By holding down Shift, we can quickly resize this image, maintaining its aspect ratio. All GMs, I have seen so many people who are willing to take a beautiful image and squish it so it looks like this. People can tell it's awful. It makes me cry. Please don't do it. And I know sometimes help it because Paint doesn't really have anything useful to do that with, but now you know you can avoid it. Hold down Shift, save a life. So we're going to get rid of that. So moving on. Now you know how to create a POG. That's great. How do we use this? How do we export it? There is a great tool within Photoshop that is a web designer's best friend, and I will share it with you today. Now, you can always go as Save As, which is probably your inclination. Then you save it to your hideously unmanaged desktop, if you're anything like me, and you go looking through all these file types like, oh, gee, gosh, oh, should this be a Photoshop, RAW, what the fuck is a Pixar? No, just don't use that. Go to File, go to Save for Web, and this is a fantastic tool. And I'm going to switch it. You'll see up here there's these little 2-up things. This is what you're paying for, people. Whenever you pay for Photoshop, you're paying for stuff like masking, and you're paying for stuff like this. This is a preview of how your image is going to export in whatever file type you desire. So I'm going to go over to this image, and I'm clicking on the right one. And you'll see that the preset's probably going to be something like a JPEG. Quick lecture on the difference between file types that are found here. You have your PNG 24, that's 24-bit. That saves it with an alpha channel. If you are saving this for Roll20 or something like Map Tools, you're going to want to use PNG 24 because that maintains the quality of the image. It also maintains the transparency. Make sure this is ticked. You can resize it. There's no reason this image should be bigger than 100 or 150 pixels. Or let's go to 200. They might zoom in on his beautiful pussy face. And not only will this tell you like how big it's going to be, but down here you'll notice that it's giving you a file size readout. And it's like, oh, hey, this is 60 kilobytes. Okay, that's not bad. That's not bad. But it's a good hint for if you're going to export this at, like, let's say this was going to be 700 pixels wide. Suddenly this is 500 kilobytes. You've got like half a megabyte for one icon. Imagine you've got 20 of these on the screen. You're going to make your players cry. Don't do that. Don't make your players cry. It's not nice. So anyways, you can hit save, export it to your hideously malmanaged desktop, and you're done. You can drag that anywhere. So that is exporting with that. Quickly, glossing over the other file types, if you want to save a map, okay, I guess if you're Irving, you do want to make your players cry. If you want to export a map, there's no reason to have transparency. You're not going to use it. It's probably not showing through to anything. Just you're going to save a lot of space by saving it as what's called a JPEG. And I'm sure you've heard of these before. It's you'll notice that this is only 11 kilobytes now. It is basically a slightly compressed image type, and if you go over here to quality, you can actually up this so it's really, really nice, and you have like no image degradation, or whatever that word is, or you can make it horrendous. And let's zoom in on this so you can see the beauty. Oh wow, God, ugh, yeah, that face. Okay. So as you can see, the difference between 100 quality and 0 is significant. You can do a lot of stuff with JPEGs. So the trick here is just finding the happy medium between my map looks like shit and my map downloads like shit. And usually I find that that medium tends to hover between 60 and 80. Now you'll notice that there's also GIFs here. Don't use GIFs. It's not 1999. If the image isn't moving, just don't use it. And that's the end of that lecture. So let's see here. You've gotten through your pogs, your little player icons. Let's move on to something a little bit more interesting. Let's talk briefly about making props and that crinkled old note. So the first trick here, and the trick to really any crinkled old note, is a crinkled old piece of paper. And let's quickly search for paper texture. And you can find these everywhere. There's all kinds of great resources for textures. Google is the first one that comes to mind. I use this image for everything. Like literally, it's embarrassing. Most of these images tend to come with a caveat, like where they'll want you to link back. Well, let's face it, only you and your players are going to see this. Don't feel bad if you don't link Twin Dragons 6669 and their beautiful texture gallery. You can pull these from Google. DeviantArt has a great collection of them. I personally keep my own little go-to folder of them, and if you have my DeviantArt, you're more than welcome to go and root through my folder. I tend to only keep ones that don't require me to link back because I'll use them in professional projects from time to time, and I don't really like managing that stuff. So once we've got our paper texture, and in this case this will do just fine, so let's go back one. This one works well. So let's copy this image. We're just going to copy this. And Photoshop, you always have to hit Control-N to start a new document. You can't just paste in and have it automatically conform. Now you'll notice that it automatically gives me the width and height of the image that I'm copying in. And that's because I have the preset set to clipboard. Just leave it as clipboard. It'll make your life easier. Hitting Control-V copies the image in. Now I'm going to go to Edit, or rather I'm going to go to Image and Image Rotation. Rotate this 90%. There we go. We got a piece of paper. Now you'll actually notice that Fantasy Flight guys, being the cool guys that they are, if you are a Dark Heresy player, will occasionally upload PDFs or leave pages intentionally blank that you as a GM can go in and copy and edit to your heart's delight. But if you like making your own textures from scratch, this is your chance. So, moving on, let's start making some text for our players. Now, you'll notice over here there's this great big old T over here. It's nice. You can go on your font downloading site of choice. These days, Google Fonts is terrific. You can find some really great stuff there. Find your cliched Gothic texts, and you can start typing. Now, this is what's called typing. This is point type. So I click, there's a point, you can see it, it's a little dot, and wherever I type, it'll appear there, and it'll keep going. So I can keep going, and it'll go off the screen. And this is really handy for titles, not so handy for whenever I want to write paragraph text, because then you start like kind of hitting enter and kind of doing this, and shit, now I gotta go hit enter again. I'm gonna go back and hit enter, and oh, it's too small, I'm gonna make it bigger. Shit, it's going off the page again, this sucks. So the way you can fix this is by making it what's called paragraph text, and you can actually convert stuff that is currently point text to paragraph text by going over to your layer palette, right-clicking, and going to convert to paragraph text. Now, you haven't seen anything happen. That's cool. If you click on it, you'll see there's this little marquee around the edge. You can actually grab these little handles and move it, and you'll notice that now it's kind of self-contained in its own little box. And being paragraph text, I can quickly go and it'll automatically wrap for me. I can resize the text, and it's that simple. By the way, I am adjusting this text in the text toolbar over here. You'll notice there's a little A with a little slash after it. You can go to Window and call that up through here. You can also go to Paragraph, and this is where you can make things center. Point text and paragraph text operate very differently if you center them. If you're using paragraph text, it will center within the area. If you're using point text, it will center on the point, which is why it shifts over here, which is really nice because you can make a big Gothic title and it will stay in the center, and then I can make a little tiny Gothic subtitle, and it still stays centered, and you don't have a case of sloppy misaligned text that your players will notice and say nothing because they pity you. And likewise, you can come up with a very nice sort of aligned thing. But once you've got this and you've got your text down and you've got the right color for it and all this good stuff, it's not looking official. You need to spice it up a little. So how we do that? How we slap a big old purity seal down in here? Well, first we go to Google. And if you're not the industrious type who likes to paint their own purity seal, you can easily find a number of easily accessible purity seals hanging out on the Googles. There's all kinds that aren't actually a photograph too, so they won't look really hinky, if that's a technical term, by the way, hinky, if they're layered down on top of a fake document here like this. So let's just probe through, and we'll probably find an illustration of one sometime soon. Oh, this one's pretty decent. That's cute. I like that. So that's right. Awesome. Let's copy that image. So now we've got this purity seal. Oh, that's nice. Except one problem. It's got this little white box around it. Well, you remember our friendly neighborhood magic wand tool? Perfect job for this. So we're going to set the tolerance to about 40, and that's just enough to select the white and the little anti-alias and JPEG corruption that's kind of going on around this edge here. And I can select this white, and it does a pretty good job getting rid of that. And once again, we can mask. We're learning how to mask. So, by the way, it's important whenever you mask, if I am selecting, like I selected this edge outside and I selected this edge, so I've got everything but this little trinket, this little purity seal selected. If I hit the mask, which is again this little circle tool, it'll, oh, oops, look at that. It unmasks the area that I wanted. Oh, well, that's a pain in the ass. Just hit Control-Z and hit Control-Shift-I, or go up to Select and Inverse, and it'll select the opposite of wherever was selected. Once again, hit Mask, and there you go. It's that simple. Now, you go in here and you start zooming in and you realize, oh god, I've got these crispy edges. Now you may not care, or maybe you're not Satan and you care about perfection and your players and your mother. Yeah, maybe I'm going a little far with that. There are ways you can clean this up even after you've masked this. And very quickly, teach you a neat trick. You can automatically select only what is opaque on any given layer. simply by, what's the button flailing around? It's Control. You'll notice if you hover over the layer bar, the layer palette over here, if you hold down Control, you'll see that this little selection box pops up. And what that means is if I click on the mask layer, which only has the purity seal selected, I will only select the purity seal, which is very nice if I want to, again, go back to Refine Edge. And you can very easily see now how crispy it is around the edge and all these white little spaces I've got here. We can quickly fix that by feathering it just a little bit, shifting the edge inwards until those little white crispies disappear, smoothing it out a little, and we'll change it to an on white, and you can see that it's very blurry. We'll move the contrast in, and there you go. You've got a very nice, sharp, crisp edge. And we can click that and very quickly modify your masked selection by going back in and, Control-Shift-I, going back in and filling those in. There we go. And now we have a nice, sharp purity seal. And no matter how dark the background behind it is, it'll always look pretty good. So, now we have our big Gothic title paper. This is my writ of passage. Neat. Now you can give these to your players. They'll celebrate. They'll print it out, put it on their wall. Excellent. Once again, exporting this, you can set it as a JPEG. You know, don't make it a PNG. It'll be like 4 megabytes. Just don't do that to your players. So let's say, let's use this as an example moment to teach you a little bit about layer types. Let's see, what would be a good way of doing this? Let's say you want to make an old looking image. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to get rid of all this text here. And I'm going to go find a beautiful image on the internet. Oh God, it's, fuck, yes. And now I can make a new document again, paste it. Let's say I want to make this look like this guy's a planetary governor. And everyone knows that hollow pics back in the day, or rather far in the future, they just don't do those 24 bits of color. So we're going to very quickly make this into an old-timey photo, and in the process teach you all about layer types by using this texture to modify this image a little bit. And not only are we going to go over text layer types, we're going to go over some non-destructive photo editing. Photoshop, the show, the extravaganza, it all starts here. So this little half moon cookie down here is what's called your different layer adjustment tools. They're just adjustment layers, that's what they are. Now there's all kinds of things here. The important thing to know about this is every time you click one of these, it'll make a new layer, and whatever you do, you will be able to undo it. Like you can just delete that layer, the effect goes away. This spawns everything from, or this covers a lot of things that previously was only possible as like a permanent thing to do to your image. Like let's say we want to make Nick Cage here into a beautiful Na'vi creature. We go to Hue Saturation, and we go to Colorize, and we make them blue. And then we go back, and we make a new layer, and we start painting some like lines and shit on them, and making them into a beautiful Na'vi. Yeah, that's the stuff. Meow. Well, shit, you know, what if we don't want them to be blue anymore? Oh yeah, the background's blue. Well, gee, I wonder if there's a way we can make him blue and make the background not blue. Or even make him not be blue anymore, because now I can't undo it. I've ruined the image. I destructed it. It's destructed. Well, here comes non-destructive image editing to save the day. You've got hue saturation down here too. We're going to colorize this. Colorize that bad boy. Move the saturation up. There we go. And now we're going to use our masking again. And you'll notice it automatically comes with a masked layer. And you can just go right in here and start painting away this layer's information. And all of a sudden you've got not just a Navi, but a Navi in Hollywood, not a Navi on their home planet, Avatar Land, or wherever the fuck that is. Ooh, ah, very nice. So, yeah, gay blue cat planet, cat planet, cat planet. So, now we've used our layer mask and our adjustment layer to make a layer that can be toggled on or off simply by clicking this eye. We're going to use this for a less silly purpose, and we're going to make this look a little bit more sepia. And the way we do that is by going to hue saturation again and just lowering the saturation a little bit. Kind of gray it out just a little bit. Now we're going to take this lovely texture we have here and we're going to copy it. Control A, copy. Now, art is subjective. Textures are subjective. How much are you willing to compromise your texture to make it look really good? Because if you stretch this out, you know, that doesn't look too bad. But let's say this image was squat, you can quickly ruin your texture by squishing it, and you'll see the little texture of the paper kind of gets elongated and stretched, and that sort of ruins the point of a texture. So, moral of the story, if you want a texture to go over your image, try to find something in the same ratio, or at least crop the image to about the same ratio. Because if you're stretching your texture, frankly, why are you even using a texture? You can always stretch it a little and get away with it, but you know, depends on the texture. Anyways, layer styles. So many options. Let's go through them one at a time, and I'll explain what they do. Now, normal is your normal opaque layer. As you can see, it's over Nick Cage. You can't see anything else below it. You can move it down to dissolve. Now, you'll notice nothing has happened. And that's because this image here is full opacity. There's no point on this layer where it's a little bit opaque. So I'll very quickly use this eraser tool over here, and I'll make a large airbrush to make a small opaque area. And if this were done on a normal layer, you'd just see this beautiful Nick Cage eye gazing through. If this were done on a dissolve layer, it actually translates this to these little pixels. Not once have I ever found this to be a useful layer ever, but now you know what it does. So that's nice. Moving on, you've got your darken. Now what this does is it takes the darkest areas on the image above and it will take them, and if there is an area on the layer below that is less dark, it will interpose that image there. There are times when this is useful. This is not one of them. Multiply. This is what most people use whenever they're making just a texture kind of overlay on something. But in my opinion, it's actually kind of gross because you'll see in this image here, it's got a lot of areas that start off being rather dark. Even these light areas here start in at about 30% opacity, like gray-wise. They're already down the color spectrum. So if you hit multiply, this image gets pretty dark. There are better ways to do this. So let us continue forward. Color burn. That's a neat effect. If you're a steampunk photo editor from 2004, me. But we all grow up and we get out of phases, so that's nice. Linear burn does the same thing, but with less saturation screw up. By the way, if you were just walked into Photoshop yesterday, saturation is how vivid a color is. So if it's very high saturated, that means there's a lot of color. If it's low saturated, that means it's kind of gray. Darker color, we've been there. Lighten, exactly like darken, except the opposite. If there is a layer, if the layer that you are on, if the layer that is set to lighten has an area that is lighter than the image below it, it will substitute that part of the image and only that part of the image. So what that means is you can actually come up with some cool stuff this way, but I won't cover that today because that's a whole other lesson. Screen, once again, this can be a pretty useful layer. A lot of this will be finicking, like you just have to kind of roll through these and find out what works for you. Color dodge, kind of like color burn, except it's the very opposite. So instead of making things really darker where the dark areas are, it makes things really light where the light areas are. Linear dodge, same thing but with less saturation, and then lighter color. Overlay. Overlay is fun. It's fun for everyone. So let's talk about overlay for a moment, because this is arguably one of the things that people who use Photoshop a lot tend to use the most. And this can be a tool of salvation, and it can be a tool of destruction, depending on how you employ it. What overlay does is it makes the layer that is overlaid, it makes all of the areas where it's dark, darker on the layer below, and it makes all the areas where it's light, lighter on the area below. And that way it's kind of like color burn and color dodge at once. And this can have repercussions on the saturation of an image, because it can make it very saturated very quickly. And as you can see here, this is fairly saturated. And all the white areas are very washed out, and all the dark areas are way too dark. So we can minimize this by just lowering the opacity, but then the texture is kind of washed out. And this is actually a pretty decent job. Like, I could upload this and not be terribly offended, but we can do better. And let's use some of the things we've learned today to make this better. So I'm going to go over to this little half moon cookie, and I'm going to briefly disable this texture so I can describe what this tool does to you, because this is, again, one of the most powerful things in Photoshop, and it's a very good tool. But if you were kind of half paying attention, now is the time to try and pay close attention, because this one's a little tricky, but it's really, really useful. So curves. What are curves? Curves are like the big brother to something called the histogram, which was the next best thing since sliced bread in the 90s. Curves represent the gradient across in any given image in black and white, and it does this on each channel. What is a channel? Each image is made out of either CMYK or RGB, and now CMYK dates back to the print area of graphic arts. RGB is really all we're concerned about. That's the light spectrum. It's what Photoshop and your monitor operates in naturally. So we're really only going to care about red, green, and blue. So what does this mean? It means that you can alter channels independently and draw out different colors depending on what channel you're using. We're going to start with RGB, which is the collection of all channels, i.e. what you see on the screen. So just RGB, this is the overall gradient composition of where your darks and your lights are in this image. Why do I care? Well, this is very powerful, a tool for not only changing how bright or how dark your image is, but also for getting a lot of information on your image. Through this image, this curves, I can see that there's a lot of darks. There's no complete blacks, because you'll see here, and I wish I could zoom in on my screen. Zoom, magnify, because this is important. I don't know if you guys can see this, but here, let's see here. I've probably screwed things up, haven't I? Yeah, okay. We'll not do that. So anyways, right here you're seeing that there's lots and lots of darks in this image. There's lots of grayscale, and there's not actually that many light areas. The taller this crest is, the more information exists on this image in that level of gray. And it'll make more sense as you play with this image. And at the end of the day, what it means is if this goes up over here, it's a lighter image. If this goes down, or if this goes up over here, then it's a darker image. Now, we can use this to our advantage by this line here, and we call this curves because you can curve this line. Now, it used to be that back in the day of Photoshop 6 and Paint Shop, histogram would only work like this, where you could move these sliders and make your whites start closer in, or you can move this slider and make your darks start lower in. Oh God. And by doing that, you can kind of people would most often use this to take scans of pencil drawings and like eliminate the grays. But more often than not, it just kind of blows out your image one way or another. With this, you can more tactfully darken or lighten an image based on what you want. And you can go inside and add extra points of information. So I can make this look like a really bright day and kind of fix some of this information by going in here and very subtly kind of pulling out these shapes. And you'll have to practice a little bit and fidget to use this, or you can make it very dark subtly and kind of go in here and start moving things around. And this is all well and good, but it really gets good whenever you start playing with the individual channels. So I can hit this, I can go into my blues, and I can bring the blues in and only the shadows. And I can do this by saying, okay, here's the shadows over here. I'm going to make a point over here, and I'm going to recorrect this line so it continues normally through the lights. But once it gets into the shadows, it starts picking up and things get a little bit more blue. And you can make this kind of look like it's a scene in the evening and pull out some of the sepia tones. And, you know, tool around. This can easily turn into an Instagram selfie shot with terrible yellow, blue peaks. But if you're careful, you can do some really cool stuff. You can modify maps, pictures of cities, things to look a little bit more like illustrations. And in this case, I'm going to use this to pull out the blues a little bit, and I'll leave it like that. And so my image is a little bit more interesting. And I'll lower the saturation. And now you'll see that it's getting somewhere. It's got a little bit of a blue shift to the sepia. I'm going to drop this texture down on top, and you'll see it's still washed out. Now, the trick with overlay is you really got to treat it a little tenderly. You have to drop a hue saturation on top of there. And I'm going to create a clipping mask again, and I'm going to lower the saturation. So it's not blowing it out as much. But as you can see, it's still blowing out these whites. All of his beautiful forehead wrinkles have disappeared. His cheek wrinkles have disappeared. We're going to go back into those curves like before, and we're going to use this, and we're going to clip this to our texture layer, and we're actually going to adjust this so our whites start in a little farther, and we're going to move the lights down so it actually starts giving us a little bit more of our information back, because the lights are starting in the grays instead, and they're not changing the image below as much. And you'll notice there's a lot of distortion. You have to play with it a little bit before you find what you really want. And I'm going to move that up a little. You can quickly create the image of Lord Governor Nick Cage, planetary nitwit. Beautiful. So that is how you very quickly check texture an image, shift its hue. You've learned a little bit about these adjustment layers, and they do all kinds of things. You can drop down solid layers, solid colors. You can drop down gradients. We'll quickly touch on that too. Adjust this image a little bit. If you drop down a gradient as an adjustment layer, you'll notice, and these always pop up. They're the style toolbars. If you click on gradients, you can go in here and kind of move things around. And once again, this is one of those things you're going to have to kind of teach yourself a little, because if I went over it today, it would easily take 30 minutes all by itself, the variety of things you can do. We will touch on it again a little bit later, well, next, whenever we get to maps, because this is a really handy little tool. But as you can see, you can very quickly make a gradient, and more importantly, you can shift the angle. You can also make it radial, which frankly I almost never do. I've never touched these ones in my life. Really linear will do you just fine. You can adjust the scale, and then at the end of the day, you can use this as a color layer. And colorful. There's ways to use this. You can use it for all kinds of things. Get creative. The potential is just, it's incredible. So, anyways, moving on from that, let's get into map making. So, what if I told you you can make a map like this in about 2 minutes? This was based off a map that I found by Googling old map, and I found something that looked a little bit like this. this map of Nantucket. And I often say to myself as a GM, I want to make my players a really cool map, but I don't want to spend 6 hours doing it because there's a good chance they're just going to say, fuck it, we don't want to go to that town anyways, and then all your work is lost. So how can we create a really big, beautiful map in as little time as possible and do this in such a way that we can easily modify it later if our needs change? Well, here comes, yeah, or they say, fuck it, lance it from orbit. Here comes layer styles again to save the day. Now, like anything in Photoshop, there are so many different ways, there are so many tools, and right now it might feel a little hard to wrap your head around it, but once you learn them and you really get them down, there's just an incredible variety and capacity to fuck around and just hack things to make them do things that you might not have otherwise thought of. You'll remember I mentioned that outer glow a little earlier. Now, you could use this potentially to make a circle. And now, by the way, layer styles will work for both raster layers and vector layers. And you'll notice this background layer is here to trick us. This is an opaque layer. It starts opaque, which means the background's filled in. If I put a layer style on this, it's not going to do anything. I actually can't because it's locked. I can't, even if I unlock it, if I put a layer style on this, it's not going to do anything because the information travels on forever. It is outside of the canvas. You will not see a drop shadow, no matter how big you make it. And interestingly enough, you can't really do inner glows or stuff too. I don't know why this is, but if you create something that just automatically spans the canvas, oh yeah, okay, there's an inner glow. I lied. So once it becomes a regular layer, you can make layer styles that are on the inside, but drop shadow is just not useful. And this black line, all this work that we put into making this beautiful black line is just useless. I cannot tell you the times that I have, as a young girl, done some line art, made a face, hi, and then I wanted to color it, and back then there wasn't a multiply layer, and suddenly, you know, it's this layer on top is opaque, and suddenly I can't do anything behind it because it's opaque. I'm drawing and I'm drawing and I'm drawing and nothing is happening because it's all opaque. This is a transparent layer. It's already transparent, and everything I draw on top of it is going to become opaque. Like before, and this is a good example, I can switch this to multiply and it shows through, as you can see. So nowadays, in modern days, we have wonderful layers like multiply to quickly make our life easier, and now we've made this terrible sperm tapeworm thing with a really happy face. Let's go back to the point. Point is, you want transparency if you're going to do layer styles. So now we have a layer that is transparent. That is neat. Let's make a little swatch here. It's red. That's neat. And let's, just so we can see what's going on behind it, we're going to go to the adjustment layers and we're just going to make a solid color. And we're going to make it white. And we're going to put it on the bottom of the layer palette over here. You'll notice I'm just clicking and dragging these around if you've wondered how I've been doing that. And we can go to this object here and I can drag it around. It's a raster image. I can drag layers around with this little move tool up here. And I'm going to go to layer effects and I'm going to go to outer glow. So what can I do with this, you might say? And you'll notice I make it black and you can't see it, and that's because outer glow is automatically set to screen. And change this to normal and the problem goes away. Actually, change this to multiply and your problem will go away. Now, right now, it's just making this blur. And this is a far cry from what we want, and I'm going to just kind of slop that over here, which is to make this map. So how can we hack our layer styles a little bit to very quickly make a map tool that's going to do something a little bit more like this? And as you can see, it's automatically making those nice little traces. We can do this by going over here, going to our outer glow, and I can get to that just by double-clicking on the effect once it's there. And you'll see that among other things here, there's this little gradient here. Now we can do this in one of two ways. We can go to this gradient and we can very painstakingly go in here and make little tiny concentric rings, or we can abuse this contour tool a little bit. And now you'll notice that there's a bunch of presets for a contour. Like I said before, a contour controls the transition from full opacity to no opacity, or actually here it controls the way that this lays down from left to right most gradient. So we're gonna use this contour, and if I click on the presets, you can very quickly see how this affects this shape. So let's leave it as this, because this is pretty similar. And you'll notice that it just sort of vaguely spawns from the shape. We want it to be really precise, so it makes these really nice concentric circles. So we're gonna change the technique from softer to precise, and you'll notice it's starting to go in the direction we want it to, but we can make this better. We can make them a little more crisp by clicking on the contour itself, and you'll see something that looks very much like the curves from before, where it's this series of little paths. If it's a line between 2 points, it was known as a path, and we can very quickly start clicking on these and adjusting them, and we're going to make little peaks here where it goes up and down, happy trees, up and down, and eventually you'll get to the point where you have made this little neat doohickey. And obviously this can be adjusted a little bit to get your perfect desired effect, but for now it's good enough. And you can adjust your size and your spread to get your desired effect, and your range as well, until you can find just the perfect happy medium to get your island shape. So we've done that. It's red, so I'm gonna make this white instead. As you can see, I'm starting to get that shape that I want over here. Now this is all well and good, and by using the adjustment layers like we did before, we can go in, we can do hue saturation, and we can make it brown. But you know what? Maybe that's good enough for you. Maybe you don't care about your players or your mother. There are other ways to do this that are even cooler. There is something in Photoshop called a gradient map. And now this is arguably one of the more cooler things in here if you know how to employ it. And basically what it does is it makes every single layer beneath it, or all the information on the layers beneath it, conform along a gradient from 0 to 100% to a new color. And so right now I can choose any of its presets, and it's kind of making these weird little, whoa, gay pride island, neat. But let's just go to the standard one for now. You'll notice if I hit, I'm just going to hit OK, and I'm going to go over here and open this map, that this isn't just brown. There's all kinds of colors in here. There's a dark reddish brown. There's yellows. There's greens in between. So how can we bring this to this simple little gray, these gray shapes here, in a very quick way that's not going to kill you, and that's a gradient map. So I can just come in here, and I can very quickly tell it to make all my darkest colors this color, and I'm gonna find where that starts, and that's about here. And then I'm gonna make a second little node here, and I'm gonna select the next darkest color, which is kind of this off yellow color. And then I'm gonna select the lightest color, which is around there. You know, I'm gonna modify it a little bit, make it a little lighter. And now we're starting to get something that looks a little closer to our image. It has a little bit more variety in it. That looks less like computer simulation and more like I am a map that has been through 200 years in a pirate's ass cheeks, and I would like to die now. And now you can slap a texture over this, and it looks less like a heaping pile of shit and more like something you would want to hand to your players. Let me just, what did I do about that? Let's grab that texture from before. Let's grab this texture and just drop that down on there. And sometimes whenever you're doing something like this, you can just use it as a multiply layer, and it works just fine. And you've got your map. Yeah, coffee stain filter. I'm sorry, Photoshop doesn't really have that anymore. I mean, they've got a bunch of filters. Some of them are pretty handy. That's not really one of them. So there you go. You've got your map. That's neat. We've got this little spit of land here. Let's multiply that. Can actually move this layer up and make the texture kind of match the same theme we got going. I'm gonna adjust this a little bit, make it a little more digestible, a little less green. And like I said, a lot of this is just tooling. You'll notice I'm not really finding the perfect color right away, and that's because nobody really ever does. It's a lot of it's fiddling to find the perfect combo. And eventually you kind of find it, usually by happenstance. Yeah, that's pretty good. So so we got Butthole Island here. Nice. We can use our mouse and draw more little circles. But this is kind of boring. We don't want the fucking island full of lily pads. So how can we add a little bit more texture to this and actually make it look how can we make this look a little bit more jagged and natural? Well, there's all kinds of brushes that Photoshop gives you. Some are a trap to lead you into a false sense of security. Like, yes, maple leaves are okay. No, they're not. Maple leaves are not okay. Don't use maple leaves. There are other tools, such as this one, that are actually quite nice. And you can use them for making little brushy effects whenever they're not being used as like this heinous. As you can see, that's quite nice. You can come up with ways to use that. It can be your, I've used this to make little blood sloths. So, anyways, it comes with its own nice little texture, which is great. Over here, however, it's not quite opaque enough for me. And what I mean by that is if I just dab it down, it kind of makes these half-assed little islands that spawn a layer style, but don't really do much in the way of creating land. And it's not opaque enough. It's not laying down a heavy enough layer. So I'm actually going to go up here to like one of these guys, and I can make it white. And this is adding a little bit more of an edge to my island. But you can see that the brush is the same every time I lay it down. Quick way to fix this, if you've got a mouse, is you go into your brush palette here, and once again, there's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to show them to you today because there's just a ton of things, and you can find out what they all do just by clicking through them. We're going to go to Shape Dynamics right now, and you'll see that there's this angle jitter, and you can move it randomly, and you'll see it gives you a preview of what your brush will look like here. And you can start to do this. And look at that, it's nice and solid. You can quickly create smaller little islands. And it looks pretty decent. So there you go, you've created a very quick map. And let's say that your players are all like, no, I don't want to go to Butthole Island. Well, you can go back even once they've seen it, and you can say, okay, fine, we won't go to Butthole Island, and you can go and erase a bunch of this information here very quickly. Boop, boop. No, and instead we're going to there is obviously something on the crater island. Very nice. Ooh, I hear your players say, we are going to the crater, because there's probably something on that crater. Now, let me introduce you briefly to warp text, which is very handy. We're going to decrease what is known as I'm probably wrong, I always mix up leading and kerning. This is the leading No, leading. Is that kerning? This is leading. Okay. We're going to make them tighter. You can do this by hitting auto. That's probably what you should do most of the time. But it generally affects the, yeah, it's leading. Okay. Or leading. Leading comes from the ancient printmaking practice of actually putting lead in between the lines, the little lines of letters whenever they were stamping down the letters on the newspaper. History lesson. You can adjust this so that they're nice and tight, like so. And now you can go back to your text, select it, and you'll notice there's this little T that's sitting on a hill. Click on that. All kinds of layer styles, or rather text styles that you can warp this. So now the floor is warped. You can make it fit your crazy long title on your new island. Very nice. Damn, you might say, that is a sweet island. Boop, and rotate it. Very nice. And there you go. You've warped some text. Let's colorize that to the same brown that is the darkest color on this island, or alternatively, we can simply move it under the gradient map, and there you go. Drop a nice rosette on that and a little mile meter, and there you go. You've just made an island in a few minutes. Want to get real crazy, you can draw a path with the pen tool and then snap the text to it. That is true. You can. With the pen tool, which is this little quill over here, you can start making these crazy vectors I've been talking about, as like so. And you can clip text to it by holding your little text thing over here. I'm typing on a hill. And you can also adjust how this sits on here by just holding down one of these tricksy random buttons again and dragging it out along the path. And we can move that around. And you'll notice it comes off of the path. It really just uses that as a style. Now this is information that is connected to this font, and I can hit enter and nothing will happen. It's kind of tricky using that tool, but you can do some really cool stuff with it if you're careful. So anyways, that's vectors. I'm gonna delete that. Now let me give you another quick option, is another powerful thing that these gradient maps can do, just to give you some ideas about the potential behind them. With some better font selection, you can easily see how a map like this might become a map like this. So here we got a really simple setup, and we've got water. We've got just a background layer. You see there's nothing here except the background layer, and there's a gradient map. Now if I click on this gradient map, I will reveal my secrets to you, and you'll notice that there's this weird little transition here. It's like water. It looks kind of like a shoreline, where it's deep water, shallow water, a shore, brown land, green land, and then ice peaks right at the very top. So what does this mean? It means that the darker something is on a layer below, the more towards the left on this gradient the image will look. So right now this canvas is completely white, so it looks completely like the color on the right side. So why do I care? What does this matter? What does this do? You can very quickly make islands. Like really nice kind of islands. Mappy type islands. Ooh, I hear you say. Very nice. Now, right now I am painting with a swatch that is not completely black, which means it never goes high enough to switch over into the ice peaks that I put right at the top of the gradient. So if I go and I grab a complete black just by clicking this thing up here, you'll notice that I start lapsing into where I put those little ice caps. And if I use a brush with a bit more texture, I can bring that out a little bit more and make it look fairly interesting. And this is all well and good. I actually prepared a map a little earlier whenever I was screwing with a coworker. And you'll notice that there's an additional thing you can do here. Let's go to Dropbox. And what did I name this? Switch it by modified. Cookie map hijinks.psd. Download. Gonna download you. So while that's downloading, it's all kinds of ways you can modify this. I'm gonna make a little island out in the water. You see, I can easily do these. Oh, yeah, those are my hard drives. I've got tits and bottoms, dongs and tops, moves and behinds, and there's another one that's not really working right now. I am 12, and what is this? So anyways, this was something I was showing a coworker, kind of why I was showing you guys. And you'll notice there's this neat little topography line thing I've got here. And it's not perfect because I did it in like 5 minutes, but this is another example of how a gradient map can be extraordinarily useful. Now, I've got the gradient map that did this right here. And you'll notice it's just a collection of lines. So this is saying from white to black, depending on the value of the layer beneath. As it goes through, it's going to quickly lapse over and over and over again to white to dark to white to dark to white to dark. And as you can see, it's terribly inconsistent. This is because I did it in about 20 minutes while a coworker was watching. If I really like this and I want to save it, I can click on it and I can hit New, and it'll save it to my gradients. And then I can move into that map I was working on. Oh, excuse me. And I can add in another layer, another gradient map. And what I'm going to do, and this is actually a little tricky now, because if I modify, the problem now is if I add another gradient map on top of this, it's going to use this value. I don't want it to use this value because it's already the blue, it's really, really dark out here, and then it's light here, and then it's really dark here, and then it's light here again. And I don't want the topography to have to go back and forth and back and forth. I want it to be a consistent black to white. So I'm actually going to copy this background layer, and I'm going to move it. I'm going to make a copy of it up here. And the way I'm doing this is I am holding down Alt while I drag it. And you'll see it makes a duplicate. This is what it looks like without any gradient map at work. So this is all that we've drawn on that bottom layer. Without our gradient map, it looks just like this. With a gradient map, it looks like this. Same thing with this map making. Ooh, you disable all these, and it's really just, you know, black lines at the end of the day. So anyways, we're going to move this back, and we're going to make this gradient map, and we're going to use that little tool that we made. And as you can see, it's not really perfect, but we can turn this into, let's see, how can we do this? Yeah, I figured it would do about that at lunch. Sometimes you'll come into a situation like this, and this is important to touch on because this will come up all the time, where you're faced with the problem of you have a lot of layer styles going on, or you have a lot of layers in your layer palettes, and things just get really complicated and muddled. So what if we want to start making this a little simpler? We've got something that's pretty close to what we want. It's not perfect, but we can work on it. We're just going to select both of these. We're going to turn it into what's called a smart object. What is a smart object? A smart object is a file that is already slightly compressed, all the layers are merged, and it's contained within the PSD that you're working in, but it minimizes the chug on your machine because it's now an image. And more importantly, it's a single file, so if you copy it many times, it will draw from the same file, and if you change it once, it'll change for everything. And I'll show you how that's enormously useful in like 2 seconds. But for now, I'm going to show you why it's nice. So I'll change it to multiply, and you can see that I'm starting to get some topography layers there. And it's not perfect. Could use a little work. So I'm going to go into this map, and I'm going to tone down those darkest areas. So I'm going to use this eraser. Oops. And come in and start working on this and making that a little lighter. And I'm going to move the flow way down, and you'll notice I'm starting to pull back into it. And it's like, oh god, chaos, things are happening. And it'll be like that. It's never really perfect. A lot of this is just very creative problem solving, hacking, doing stuff that just feels right. Just feels right. So we'll close out of this, and if you save it, that automatically saves the layer within the layer type. And as you can see, we've put a little bit of a topography thing to this map here. I'm not happy with it. It's really quick. It's really simple. But if you were to work on that gradient, you would find that you could come up with something pretty cool. So finally, using smart objects a little smarter. Let's say that what's a good situation for this one? Here, let's finish this one up real quick, and then we'll move on to smart objects. One of the problems that you'll likely encounter whenever you're using techniques like this is that you're just perma-stuck with this really soft gradient here, and you can kind of quickly muddle this by going to your filter gallery, and you'll find you can look through and find some different treatments that it'll do. Photoshop will just automatically create. And I'm going to make something that looks a little bit more like actual water. So I'm going to use that, and as you can see, it very quickly makes into a very much more interesting map. It actually looks a bit like water down here, so that's neat. Experiment with filter types. There's all kinds. You won't use them that much, but occasionally they're useful. So let's see here. What's a good example for using a layer, smart layer? Okay. Let's take a picture of a skull. Now, places where you'll find this useful could not be divined by me at this instant, but there will come a time when you'll say, gee, I sure wish I just knew how to do this, and this is how you do it. So I've got this skull. That's nice. I'm going to make 5 of these skulls, and now I'm going to select them all by using that move tool and clicking out in the white space and just dragging it over them all, and you'll see it selects them all in the layer palette over here. And I'm going to change them to multiply so their little white spaces don't show up on each other. Now I can move them around. And now let's say I want to make one of them into a servo skull. So I'm just going to come over here, and I'm very quickly going to just kind of bullshit a little cyber eye. We'll make sure I'm drawing on the one I want to by clicking on them, selecting that layer. And I'm going to move the flow up. I'm going to move the brush spacing down once again, make a nice smooth line. There we go. Ooh, servo skull. Neat. So, once you've done that, but what if I want them all to be servo skulls? What if I want to update them all to be servo skulls? Well, you could delete them all. But, you know, what if you had something like this, where you very painstakingly, and I'm using hotkeys here to copy things. If you hold down Alt while you drag something, you'll make a copy. Copy. If you hold down Shift, you'll make things move by increments. What if you say you've painstakingly made this this little pinwheel of servo skulls? Neat. Well, now I'm kind of screwed because I really want to give this one a top hat, but it won't give the rest of them top hats. That makes me sad because I don't want to go through and like draw all of them, and I don't want to redo it and rearrange them. So what can I do to avert this sad fate? Well, we can make them what's called a smart object, where I take this obviously well-bred servo skull gentleman, and I'm going to make him into a smart object. And now what I've got here are 2 exact copies of the same image, and you'll notice when I select them, and I do stuff like this, like I hit the handle or I try and draw, nothing will happen. And that's because it's no longer an editable file on the base canvas. it is now contained in a separate file, and these are actually the same image, not just in appearance, but literally the same data that I am dragging around. So what does this mean? This means if I go in here and I double click on this fellow, which makes me go into the file where he's stored, I can edit him to have 2 servo eyes. And whenever I hit X and I save it, they will all have them because they're the same file. Where can you use this? You can use it in tons of places. I used it for putting trees on a map. I've used it for mostly graphic design, to be perfectly honest. Or for one occasion, I went through for my players and I made all of these little character sheets for some Crimson Guard that were following them around. And I just had them all on one big sheet. And whenever I was working on this, I wanted this border to be here, but I didn't want to have to redo it for all 12 Skitari. So I just edited it on one, and since it was a smart object, it automatically duplicated it to all 16 of the fuckers. There are times like that when that can be really useful. So that is about all I wanted to cover today. Those are all the basics and some really advanced stuff. Fortunately, this is saved as a file, so if you ever want to go back and reference something, or you missed something, or I went by a little bit too fast, you can reference the file and pull from it. But in the meantime, do you guys have any questions? Was there anything I skimmed over too quickly? Is there anything you'd like to know how to do? I'm only 6 minutes over the time I guessed, so yay. Make a servo skull with a top hat. Okay, I will make a servo skull with a top hat. Where'd the skull go? Do I still have that to my paste layer? Yes, I do. You want this as a Facebook icon now. Okay. I'm going to quickly... So what I'm doing here, these are vectors. This is a lesson for another day. Or now, if you really want to know. You guys want to know how to manipulate vectors? That is a whole can of worms, let me tell you. There we go. Is that a good enough servo skull for you? What's that? Man, Illustrator, yeah. So one of the things that you'll hear as a complaint from graphic designers or illustrators is that everyone has their preference whenever it comes to programs like Illustrator and Photoshop. Illustrator for the longest time was really your best resource for doing vectors in any context. But Photoshop, in the way that Photoshop does, has quietly, like a tumor, kind of come to integrate a lot of the Adobe products that they've acquired over the years. And now it can do vectors fairly well, and personally I prefer to use vectors in Photoshop just because of the diversity of things that I can quickly do with them and like integrate them with raster. I'm the kind of person who likes to go make a vector and then very quickly make it a raster and screw with it, and you can't easily do that in Illustrator. Illustrator has its advantages. It has some stuff that's really cool that it can do very quickly. It snaps to pixels fairly well. You can do some really nice mathematical ratio type stuff in there. and things that Photoshop is just really not meant to do. That said, you know, to each their own. My workflow happens quickest in Photoshop, and frankly, I do just fine doing vectors in here. And I've had plenty of people tell me that you're just not a real vector illustrator if you're using Photoshop. Well, you know, screw you, buddy, because you can use whatever the hell you want and call yourself whatever the hell you want. All that matters at the end of the day is the product. At least that's my 2 cents. I'll get off my soapbox now. Let's see here. And you'll see I'm using a bunch of different techniques that I talked about whenever we were going through the Photoshop suite. There you go, James. That's a monocled servo skull or so, I suppose. I'll make it nice and transparent for you. And now you can kind of see how quickly things can go once you get the hang of it. It may seem really slow at first, and you'll probably get hung up on a lot of weird random things that will happen and you won't really know what's going on, kind of like that the live paint tool. But you keep working at it, keep faith. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. I'm always happy to help somebody out with Photoshop. It's one of those things that you can either fiddle with it for years, you can pay thousands of dollars to get an art education and do, or you can just have somebody help you with it, and I am more than happy to help you with your Photoshop woes. Yeah, no problem. So let's see here. Is there anything else you guys would like to know how to do? Nope. Okay, cool. Well, that concludes today. Thank you so much for stopping in. Hopefully it was educational. This will live on YouTube later on, so if you want to reference something or go back to it or point somebody to it, by all means. And I am always around if you want to talk to me. So that will be all. Good night. Good luck. Happy Photoshopping.